I'm so sorry, Miss Hartley. I didn't mean...
Oh my God, she's pregnant!
Do you have any idea what this dress cost?
It was an accident.
Then make sure it never happens again. Someone needs to stop her. She's the senator's daughter. Nobody's ever told her no a day in her life.
That's exactly the problem.
One day, she's gonna cross the wrong person.
I spent my whole life believing power meant making people fear me. I had spent years making sure no one ever said no to me twice. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me was losing my father's approval. I thought control meant safety. I thought if I held the room hostage, nothing could ever touch me. I never imagined the first person who refused to fear me would become my husband. I didn't know yet what real fear felt like, the kind that doesn't care who your father is. I was wrong about almost everything that year. I had no idea how wrong I was. By sunrise, the video of Senator Conrad Hartley's daughter slapping a pregnant event coordinator had already spread across every major news outlet in America. The clip crossed 11 million views before the Capitol had even finished waking up. News anchors who had never said her name before were saying it every 15 minutes. Senator Hartley's office phone did not stop ringing. What Marlowe believed was just another ordinary scandal would become the first domino in a chain of events that would change her life forever. Within weeks, the most feared politician in the state would force his only daughter into a marriage she never wanted, with the only man powerful enough to look her in the eye and refuse to be afraid of her. But the people screaming the loudest about Marlowe Hartley that week had no idea what was already being arranged behind closed doors, 3 states away, in a house that had nothing to do with politics at all. They didn't know a dying woman named Eleanor Lockhart had just made one phone call that would change everything. They didn't know that somewhere in that family, someone had already decided both Marlowe and the man she hadn't met yet needed to disappear. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marlowe Hartley grew up inside a house with 14 rooms and almost no one in any of them. Her father called it privacy. The staff who raised her called it something closer to absence. On her 10th birthday, the dining hall was filled with caterers, a string trio, and 40 guests her father had invited for the photographs. Neither of her parents stayed past the cake. A housekeeper named Della sat with her afterward in the kitchen and let her eat the leftover frosting straight from the bowl, and for years that was the warmest memory Marlowe owned. She still remembers what she told herself that night, sitting alone in a dress that cost more than Della's monthly salary. I had every toy in the catalog, and no one to show them to. She never said it out loud to anyone. She didn't have to. The house had already taught her the lesson it was built to teach. Attention, even the wrong kind, was the only currency that ever worked. At 14, she won a debate competition her father had promised to attend. He sent a car instead, with a note congratulating her and a check for new shoes. She kept the note. She threw away the check. By 16, she had stopped expecting either of her parents to show up to anything that wasn't a photograph opportunity, and she had started understanding, with the clear, cold logic of a child raised by absence, that the version of her that got noticed was never the soft one. The soft one got sent a car. The sharp one, the cruel one, the one who made people flinch, got headlines, and headlines, at least, felt like being seen. By the time she was 26, Marlowe had perfected the art of being seen. She learned that a raised voice got her sent to her room, but a perfectly aimed, ice-calm cruelty got her exactly what she wanted, every single time. 3 weeks before the fashion show, she had a boutique salesperson named Megan Pierce fired over the phone for folding a blouse the wrong way. She didn't yell. She simply called the store owner, used her father's name twice in one sentence, and hung up before he could finish apologizing. Ms. Hartley, I assure you, Megan is one of our best, the store owner started, and Marlowe cut him off before he could finish. Fire her by the end of the day, she said, or explain to every name on your client list why you let a girl who can't fold a blouse cost them their favorite designer. That's not a threat. That's arithmetic. Megan lost her job that same afternoon. Marlowe never thought about her again. A week later, at a private members club her father belonged to, she watched a junior staffer spill a single drop of champagne near her shoe and demanded the man be removed from the floor for the rest of the evening, loud enough for 3 tables to hear it. The club manager tried to intervene. Ms. Hartley, he's new. He's only been with us a week. Good, Marlowe said. Maybe the next one will learn to watch where he's standing before I have to teach him myself. This was the woman the country would meet in that viral clip days later, and the country was right to be furious. What the country didn't know yet was what was underneath that woman, and the story was about to force everyone, including her, to find out. By morning, the clip from the fashion show had already been clipped, captioned, and replayed on every major morning show in the country. A panel of commentators debated her on live television, none of whom had ever met her, all of whom had an opinion about who she was. This is what happens when money replaces parenting, one said. That woman has never once heard the word no in her entire life. Another leaned in before the first had even finished. And now an innocent pregnant woman is the one who paid for it. I hope there are real consequences this time, not just another statement from her father's office. Strangers online dug up old photographs of her from years earlier, repurposing every smile, every party, every charity event into evidence of a pattern they were certain they understood completely. None of them knew about Della, or the debate competition, or the check she threw away. They only knew the version of her that the cameras had ever been allowed to see, and that version was more than enough to make an entire country furious. Senator Conrad Hartley had built a 20-year career on the image of a steady, principled family man. He didn't get angry when the video broke. He got strategic. His chief of staff, a sharp, exhausted man named Walter Pruitt, brought him 3 different crisis statements before breakfast, and Conrad read all 3 standing up without sitting down once. Senator, the donors are calling, Walter told him. 3 of them already this morning. Which 3? Conrad asked. The ones who matter. Conrad didn't hesitate. Get me a statement that makes me sound heartbroken. Not complicit, he said. The public forgives a father who's disappointed. They crucify one who looks weak. Walter hesitated before he asked the question that actually mattered. And Marlowe? Has anyone actually checked on her? Conrad did not answer. He simply picked up the second draft and began marking it with a pen. Marlowe wasn't in the room to hear any of it, but she didn't need to be. She had heard versions of that same silence her entire life, in different rooms, about different disasters, and every time it told her the same thing about where she actually stood with him. 3 states away, in a quiet stone house outside the city, Eleanor Lockhart sat across from her oncologist and received the kind of news that ends arguments about time. She did not cry. She thanked the doctor, walked out to her car, and called her grandson before she called anyone else. Cassius Lockhart was in the middle of dismantling a billion-dollar acquisition when her name appeared on his screen, and he excused himself from the room without explanation because no one in his life called him in the middle of a deal except her. "I'm dying, Cassius," she said with no warning and no softness, because softness had never been her language either, "and I am not leaving this company to a man who treats marriage like a hobby he hasn't gotten around to." Cassius Lockhart had built an empire out of $200 and a refusal to ever be embarrassed again. People who worked for him feared him, but almost no one who worked for him hated him, and that distinction mattered more than anyone realized. The week before his grandmother's call, he sat at the head of a boardroom table while a rival executive tried to walk back a deal already signed in ink. "Mr. Lockhart, if you'll just give us 30 days to restructure the terms," the executive started. Cassius didn't let him finish. "You had 90 days and a legal team that costs more than your company is worth," he said. "The contract stands. Get out before I decide charity was a mistake." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look up from his tablet again for the rest of the meeting, and the room emptied itself without him asking twice. Later that same week, a tabloid photographer caught him walking through a crowd outside his building, shouting questions about his latest broken engagement rumor. Cassius didn't slow down, didn't flinch, didn't answer. He had a habit no one was supposed to know about. Every month, quietly, through an account with no name attached, he paid the medical bills of a junior analyst whose daughter had been sick for years. He never mentioned it. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted the problem solved, and then he wanted to move on, the same way he handled everything else in his life, including the one woman who had ever made him feel something close to safety, right before she sold the story of their relationship to a tabloid for $40,000. He had not trusted anyone fully since. Why would a man with that much control, that much discipline, and that much money agree to marry a stranger his own grandmother had chosen for him? The answer was already in motion, and it had nothing to do with love. Eleonora delivered her ultimatum to Cassius in person, in the same stone house where she had just left her oncologist hours earlier, refusing to let illness slow down a single word of it. "Marry, settle, and prove to this board and this family that the Lockhart name survives you," she told him. "Or I sign every share you've spent 15 years building over to Vivian before the month is out." "Vivian runs a charity foundation," Cassius said. "She's never closed a deal in her life. She's never once made this family a punchline," Eleonora answered. "At my age, that's worth more to me than every deal you've ever closed combined." Cassius said nothing for a long moment. Vivian ran the family's charity foundation with a warmth everyone adored, the kind of granddaughter who sent flowers on birthdays and remembered everyone's coffee order. Cassius had never once suspected her of anything. Neither had Eleonora. That was precisely the problem nobody in that family could see yet. Eleonora and Senator Hartley had known each other for almost 30 years, since a fundraiser neither of them remembered the name of, back when both of their families needed each other more quietly than they did now. The call between them lasted under 6 minutes. Eleonora explained her diagnosis and her conditions. Conrad explained his daughter's video and his collapsing approval numbers. By the end of the conversation, two people who had never once asked either of their children what they wanted had agreed to merge their families like a business filing. In the senator's study that same week, the deal was finalized over coffee neither of them touched.
Your boy
needs a wife the press will respect,
Your girl needs a
Conrad
husband who can
said.
survive her.
Your girl needs a husband who can survive her, Eleonora
There's a
answered.
difference, and your
She's
daughter
not
has
as
both.
difficult as the headlines make her sound, he said. I didn't say difficult, she told him. I said dangerous. There's a difference, and your daughter has both. Neither one flinched. In the corner of that same office, half forgotten by everyone in the room, sat Marlowe's cousin Roman Hartley, quiet, watching, taking in every word with the kind of attention nobody in that family had ever bothered to notice in him before. 3 days later, at a luncheon for the Lockhart Family Foundation, Vivian Lockhart heard the news of her cousin's engagement secondhand, from a board member who assumed she already knew. I'm so glad Cassius is finally settling down, the board member said. Aren't you relieved, Vivian? Relieved doesn't begin to cover it, Vivian answered. I just want him happy. That's all any of us should want for him. She smiled the entire time she said it, warm and convincing, the same smile that had made her the most beloved Lockhart in any room she ever walked into. No one in that luncheon noticed her knuckles had gone white around her coffee cup. Marlowe found out about the arrangement the way she found out about most decisions concerning her own life, secondhand, through her father's assistant, 2 days after it had already been agreed to. She walked into his study already furious and walked out completely undone. You arranged my marriage and didn't think to tell me first? She demanded. I'm telling you now, Conrad said. You didn't try to fix me, she told him. You just found someone rich enough to make me somebody else's problem. Conrad didn't soften. I'd rather salvage what's left of this family's name before you finish destroying it yourself, he said. You refuse this marriage, and I'll release a statement disowning you publicly by the end of the week. I'll frame it as a father's heartbreak. People will believe every word of it because they already think the worst of you, and for once, I won't even have to lie to convince them. For the first time in years, her voice cracked in front of him instead of at him. She had never once heard him threaten her with anything real before. This was real, and something in the way he said it told her he had already drafted the statement, that this conversation had only ever been a formality. Cassius received his version of the same ultimatum with considerably less noise. Eleonora simply slid a single page across the table, the redirection of his inheritance to Vivian, already drafted, already notarized, needing only his refusal to become permanent. He read it twice. He looked at his grandmother, the only person who had raised him after his parents proved incapable of it, and understood that this wasn't cruelty from her. It was the only language she had left to make sure he survived what came after her. I don't need a wife, he told her, flat and unmoved. I need a headline that stops bleeding. Eleonora didn't smile, but something in her face eased slightly, because she had expected resistance, and instead she had gotten exactly the kind of cold practicality that told her he would actually go through with it. 3 days before the wedding, both families stood together at a press conference neither Marlowe nor Cassius had asked for, framed as a celebration, scripted down to the last sentence. Senator Hartley stood at the podium with his hand on his daughter's shoulder, a gesture that looked protective on camera and felt like nothing at all to the woman underneath it. A reporter called out from the crowd, "Senator, is it true the wedding was arranged rather quickly? Some are speculating this is more business than romance." Conrad didn't hesitate. Love doesn't follow a calendar, but business sense knows a good match when it sees one, he said. My daughter and Mr. Lockhart found each other at exactly the right time. Another reporter turned to Cassius. Mr. Lockhart, any comment? Marlowe is exactly who I need beside me right now, he said. I think that surprises people more than it should. It was, technically, not a lie. Marlowe stood beside him, smiling the practiced smile she had been performing since childhood, and said nothing at all, because nothing she could have said would have been true either. The wedding took place 11 days later, fast enough that the press barely had time to speculate before it became official. Marlowe wore black to her own ceremony, a quiet, deliberate act of rebellion that every camera in the room captured and every headline the next morning ignored, because nothing about that day was framed as a celebration. It was framed as a rescue, his family's rescue of hers, and everyone in attendance understood the performance for what it was. Cassius did not look at her once during the vows. When the officiant asked if he took Marlowe to be his lawfully wedded wife, he answered with 2 flat words, I do. When she was asked the same question in return, Marlowe gave the same 2 words back, just as empty, I do. Neither voice carried a single trace of warmth. At the reception, Senator Hartley raised a glass in front of 300 guests and delivered a toast that mentioned legacy 4 times and his daughter's happiness not once. To 2 families becoming one, he said, to strength, to stability, and to the future. Eleonora Lockhart, seated beside him, raised her glass a half-second slower, watching her grandson's face for any sign of what he actually felt. She found none. Their first dance afterward was stiff, his hand barely resting at her waist, her spine locked straight the entire 3 minutes. Two strangers performing intimacy for 300 guests who already knew it was a lie. That night, in the house that was now legally both of theirs, Marlowe locked herself in the room farthest from his and refused to come out. She sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar house, still in her wedding dress, and allowed herself exactly 4 minutes to feel the full weight of what had just happened to her life before she forced herself to stop. Cassius didn't bother knocking. He went to his study instead, poured a drink he didn't finish, and sat in the dark longer than he would have admitted to anyone, turning over the same thought he couldn't quite silence, that he had just legally bound his future to a stranger his grandmother had chosen out of necessity, not judgment. Their first real conversation as husband and wife happened the following morning in the kitchen, and it was not gentle. I'd rather die than be married to someone like you, Marlowe told him. Don't tempt me, Cassius answered. I've already checked the insurance policy. You're a monster, she said. You're a child playing at being cruel, he told her. I'm just tired enough not to correct you. We deserve each other. Neither of them said another word that morning. Neither of them forgot a single one of those 4 sentences either. The first 3 months of the marriage were exactly what both families had hoped for on paper, and exactly what neither of them had hoped for in private. Marlowe and Cassius lived under the same roof and avoided each other with the precision of 2 people who had trained their whole lives to win at avoidance. The tabloids quieted, the senator's numbers stabilized. Eleonora, weaker by the week, allowed herself a small, private relief that the worst of it might already be behind them. It wasn't. Not long after the wedding, they were required to attend a charity polo match together, the first public appearance of the marriage outside the wedding itself. Marlowe smiled for every camera and said almost nothing to Cassius the entire afternoon. A reporter pushed a microphone toward them on the way to the car. Mrs. Lockhart, how does married life suit you? Married life suits me exactly as well as you'd expect, Marlowe answered. She didn't wait for a follow-up question. Cassius said nothing at all, simply opened the car door and waited for her to get in first. A courtesy that meant nothing and everything at the same time. At a board dinner some weeks later, Marlowe noticed for the first time how carefully Cassius listened when other people spoke, how he never interrupted, how he asked exactly one sharp question that exposed a weakness in a competitor's pitch within seconds. She found herself watching him longer than she meant to. After the dinner ended and the other guests had cleared out, Marlowe found Cassius still in the empty dining room, alone with a glass of wine, staring at nothing in particular.
That question
She almost walked past him.
I read everything
She didn't.
twice. Most
That
people
question
only
you
read it
asked
once.
tonight, she
Neither
said,
of you.
about their supply contracts. How did you know to ask it? He glanced up, surprised she'd noticed it all. I read everything twice, he said. Most people only read it once and think that's enough. Most people aren't as paranoid as you. Most people haven't been betrayed by someone who read it once and missed the part that mattered. She sat down across from him, uninvited, and for the first time in 3 months, neither of them made a move to leave the room. You're not what I expected, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. Neither are you, he said. Something in the air between them had shifted, quiet and unremarked. Neither of them said another word about it. Neither of them forgot it either. As the weeks wore on, the cracks in the performance started showing in smaller, quieter ways. Marlowe began eating dinner an hour earlier, just to avoid sitting at the table with him. Cassius began working later, sometimes not coming home until well past midnight. Neither of them mentioned it to the other. Both of them noticed. One evening in late autumn, a member of the household staff, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth Calloway, who had worked for the Lockhart family for almost 6 years, accidentally knocked an antique vase off a side table while dusting. It shattered across the marble floor, scattering porcelain across the room in a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Marlowe, already in a foul mood from a call with her father, crossed the room
I'm so
and
sorry, I
struck her
didn't mean-
without
you
a
never
single
mean to.
word of warning.
Careless is free
The
for people like
same
you. It's the only
cold,
thing you can
deliberate
actually afford.
slap the entire country had already watched her deliver once before. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Lockhart. I didn't mean—" Ruth started. "You never mean to," Marlowe told her. "Careless is free for people like you. It's the only thing you can actually afford." Cassius was standing in the doorway. He said nothing in that exact moment, which somehow felt worse to Marlowe than if he had shouted. He simply watched and walked away. He found her an hour later in the hallway and spoke to her in a voice so quiet it took her a second to register the threat buried inside it. "Touch my staff again," he said, "and I will personally dismantle your father's campaign one donor at a time until there's nothing left to disown." "Test me once."
You can't talk to me like
"You can't talk to me like that," she said.
I just did.
"I just did," he answered. Marlowe stared at him, genuinely stunned, because in 26 years of being indulged by every adult who had ever mattered, no one had ever outmaneuvered her instead of simply giving in. She didn't apologize. She wasn't ready for that yet. But she never raised her hand to staff again, and that single sentence from a man she claimed to despise did something her father's threats never had. She never told anyone what she actually felt walking away from him that night. "No one has ever made me feel small without raising their voice before," she admitted only to herself. Late that same night, unable to sleep, Marlowe found Ruth alone in the staff kitchen, icing her own cheek in silence under the dim glow of a single overhead light. Marlowe stood in the doorway for a long moment before Ruth even noticed her there. She didn't apologize. She wasn't capable of that yet, but she left an envelope of cash on the counter without a word and walked out before Ruth could even turn around, never confirming it had been her, never mentioning it again to anyone for as long as she lived in that house. It was the first private act of decency in her entire adult life, witnessed by no one, claimed by no one, and it sat there in the dark like the first small crack in a wall that had taken 26 years to build. What neither Marlowe nor Cassius noticed, in the middle of their own private war, was how often Marlowe's cousin Roman had started appearing in rooms he had no obvious reason to be in. He sat in on board calls that weren't his to attend. One afternoon, he found Marlowe alone in her father's study and lingered far longer than the visit required. "How's married life treating you?" he asked. "You look thinner." "I look fine, Roman," she said. "Did you need something, or did you just come to stare?" "Just checking in on family," he told her. Your father's campaign finances have been a mess lately,
Since
you
when do
know.
you care about my
I've been
father's
helping him
finances?
sort through some of it. "Since when do you care about my father's finances?" she asked. "Since they became my problem too," he said. He smiled when he said it, the kind of smile that gave nothing away, and changed the subject before she could press further. That same week, a cable news anchor read a headline live on air claiming the Lockhart marriage was already a sham behind closed doors, sourced from someone with detailed, accurate knowledge no outsider should have had. Marlowe watched it for exactly 4 seconds before muting the television. She had bigger things occupying her mind that month than wondering who in her own family might be paying closer attention to her life than she was. On the other side of the same week, Vivian Lockhart paid Cassius an unannounced visit at his office, arriving with a tray of pastries and a smile that disarmed his assistant before he could even ask if Cassius was free. "I just wanted to see how you're settling in," she told him. "Marriage suits you, I think. You look less tired." "I'm the same as I always am," Cassius said. "You're never the same as you always are, Cassius," she answered. "You just don't let anyone close enough to notice the difference." She left 20 minutes later, having asked 3 separate questions about the foundation's funding structure and whether his new wife's father might be persuaded to support it. Cassius didn't think twice about any of it. Vivian had always asked questions like that. It had simply never occurred to him to wonder why. The following week, while reviewing a stack of campaign finance documents her father had asked her to organize for an upcoming filing, Marlowe noticed a transfer she didn't recognize, routed through an account she had never seen listed before, the kind of number small enough not to draw attention and large enough to matter if anyone ever looked closely. She mentioned it to Roman, almost in passing, expecting nothing. "Do you know anything about this account?" she asked. "It's not one of Dad's usual ones. Probably just an old donor fund," Roman said. "I'll look into it for you so you don't have to." He took the folder from her hands before she could finish reading it herself, smiling the entire time, and Marlowe let him, because at that point in her life she had never once been given a reason to suspect her own cousin of anything. She wouldn't think about that folder again for a long time. Not long after, on a stretch of road just outside the city, Marlowe's car was run off the highway by a vehicle that never stopped. She remembers the headlights in her mirror growing too close too fast, the sound of her own voice telling herself to brake, and then nothing but motion she couldn't control. The impact sent her spinning across 2 lanes before the guardrail finally stopped the car from going over the embankment entirely. She survived. She did not survive it composed. A passing driver called for help. Paramedics found her conscious but shaking, repeating the same sentence over and over before they could get her fully out of the wreckage. "Someone did this," she kept saying. "Someone did this on purpose." In the hospital that night, for the first time in her entire life, Marlowe Hartley cried in front of someone other than herself, full, shaking, frightened sobs that had nothing performative about them at all, because for the first time, no amount of money or power had been enough to keep her safe. Her father arrived within the hour, and the first words out of his mouth, before he had even looked at her face, were directed at Walter Pruitt. "Has anyone leaked this to the press yet?" Marlowe heard it through the door of her hospital room, still in a gown, an IV in her arm, completely alone. She would never repeat what she thought lying in that bed, listening to her father's voice in the hallway outside. "He's not scared I almost died," she told herself. "He's scared of what people will say about it." It was the clearest, coldest confirmation of something she had spent her whole life refusing to admit to herself, that being protected and being loved had never once been the same thing in that house. Cassius arrived later that same night, not out of love, not yet, but because the marriage made it expected of him. He found her sitting up in the dark, mascara dried in tracks down her face, and something in him shifted that he didn't have a name for. He had never once seen her unguarded before. You didn't have to come,
I know.
she said.
Then why are
I
you
know,
here?
he answered.
still working that
Then
out.
why are you here?
Who would wanna kill me?
I'm still working that out.
But none
She
of the-
almost laughed despite everything. A small, broken sound that surprised them both. "Who would want to kill me?" she asked him quietly, her voice still raw. "Half the city," he answered, not unkindly. "But none of them would be stupid enough to actually try." "You think it was someone close," she said. "I think," he told her, "you're not as untouchable as you believe." For the first time since the wedding, she looked at him without hatred. She looked at him with fear instead, and for the first time, he didn't look away from it. 3 nights after the hospital released her, Marlowe still couldn't sleep. She found Cassius on the terrace outside his study, tie long gone, sleeves rolled to the forearm, staring out at the city like it owed him an answer. She almost turned back. She didn't. "Can't sleep either," she said, more statement than question. "Haven't really slept since the crash," he admitted, and the honesty of it surprised her enough that she stayed. She leaned against the railing beside him, closer than either of them meant to allow. "Why did you actually come to the hospital that night?" she asked. "I've been wondering." He was quiet for a long moment. "Because for 6 months, I've told myself none of this was real," he said. "And then I saw you in that bed, and it was the most real thing I'd felt in years." She didn't have an answer for that. He turned to look at her fully for the first time, and whatever careful distance either of them had been maintaining collapsed without either of them choosing it.
Cassius.
The kiss that followed wasn't planned by either of them, wasn't performed for anyone the way every other moment of their marriage had been. It was the first thing between them that belonged only to them. When it ended, neither of them said anything at first. Marlowe stepped back, her hand rising briefly to her own mouth,
night, Cassius.
as if checking it had actually happened. "Good night, Cassius," she said, and left before he could answer. He stood alone on the terrace for a long time afterward, replaying it, not entirely sure he believed it either. Neither of them mentioned it the next morning. She left the kitchen before he came down. He worked late again that night, later than he needed to, because he wasn't sure yet what to do with a feeling that hadn't asked his permission to exist. Neither of them stopped thinking about it. Neither of them said a single word about it to the other for a long time still. What no one in either family noticed, in the middle of all of it, was how closely Eleanora Lockhart had begun watching her own granddaughter. Vivian's visits to Cassius's office had been mentioned to her in passing, innocently, by a board member who thought nothing of it. Eleanora thought something of it. She said nothing to Cassius. She wasn't ready to accuse anyone of anything yet, not without proof, not while she was still weak enough that any mistake could be her last. But she began keeping a private notebook of small, otherwise meaningless details, dates, names, numbers that didn't quite add up. The same instinct that had built an empire from nothing now turned quietly inward on her own family. "I have been wrong about people before," she told herself. "I am not wrong about this," she told no one. Not yet. The notebook stayed locked in a drawer, only she had the key to, and the story would not let the audience see what was written inside it for a long time still. Weeks later, Cassius's driver was running 11 minutes behind schedule. He had stopped to take a call from his daughter's school, a delay so small and so ordinary that it would later feel impossible it had saved a man's life. Cassius stood in the underground garage of his own building, checking his watch, mildly irritated at the wait, with no idea how close he was standing to the end of everything. The explosion tore through the concrete level without warning, a single violent burst of sound and heat that sent 2 parked cars airborne and shattered every window on that floor of the structure. Cassius was thrown back against a concrete pillar, ears ringing, the world gone briefly silent and white. Upstairs, Marlowe felt the building shudder beneath her feet and was running down 4 flights of stairs in bare feet before she had even fully processed why, screaming his name before she reached the bottom landing.
Where are you?
"Cassius!" she screamed. "Cassius, where are you?" When she found him standing, shaken but alive, 20 feet from the wreckage, blood at his temple from a piece of flying debris, something broke open in her that she hadn't expected and didn't yet understand, a fear for a man she had spent months claiming to despise, sharp enough to frighten her almost as much as the explosion itself had. Security guards swarmed the garage within minutes. Sirens were already audible in the distance. A stunned valet attendant, still on the ground from the blast wave, kept repeating the same sentence to no one in particular. "That was his car," he said. "That was supposed to be his car." "Who would want to kill both of us?" she demanded, her hands still trembling as a paramedic tried to check the cut above his eyebrow, and Cassius waved him off twice. "Someone who benefits from both of us being gone," he answered, watching the wreckage instead of her. "That narrows it down to every business rival, every political enemy, and half your ex-girlfriends," she said, and despite everything, despite the smoke still curling out of the garage behind them, something close to a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You're funny when you're scared," he told her. "I'm not scared," she said. "I'm furious." "Good," he answered. "Use it." She held his gaze a moment longer than either of them expected. something unspoken passing between two people who had spent 6 months perfecting the art of not looking at each other directly. Standing in that garage, surrounded by sirens and shattered glass, both of them finally understood what the audience watching this story already suspects. This was never about one of them. The car running her off the road could have been explained away as random, a coincidence, the kind of thing wealthy, hated people sometimes survive without ever learning why. The bomb made that explanation impossible. Someone close enough to know both of their schedules, both of their movements, both of their weaknesses, wanted them gone, together. And whoever it was had been patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment to strike twice. Neither Marlowe nor Cassius said it out loud yet, but standing in that wreckage, something had shifted permanently between them, the first fragile thread of an alliance neither of them had wanted, and neither of them could now afford to refuse. The wreckage was still smoking when the ambulance arrived, the same scene the entire story opened with, except now every word of it lands differently. Paramedics moved fast around them, calling out vitals, securing a stretcher, the noise of sirens, and shouted instructions blurring into one continuous wall of sound. Cassius wouldn't let go of her hand long enough for them to separate her from him, even when a paramedic asked him to step back. "Sir, I need you to let us work," the paramedic said. "Not until she's stable," Cassius answered. "Not until I see her stable." Marlowe's hands are still shaking around the collar of Cassius's jacket as he pulls her clear of the car for the second time in this story, sirens closing in from every direction, neither of them speaking, because there is nothing left to say that the moment hasn't already said for them. 6 months ago, Marlowe Hartley married a man she despised to save her father's career. Tonight, for the second time, that same man was the only reason she was still breathing. 2 attacks, 2 survivors. Someone had already tried to kill them both, twice, and failed twice. Someone close enough to know their schedules, their movements, their weaknesses. Someone still hiding in plain sight inside one of their own families, sitting at their dinner tables, smiling in their photographs, and they had absolutely no idea who it was. So the question isn't whether they'll survive each other anymore. The question the entire world is about to start asking is this: who hates them enough to want them both dead? And how much closer do they have to get before somebody finally sees it coming? Marlowe had spent her entire life believing no one was powerful enough to stand against her. But for the first time in her life, she realized the greatest danger wasn't standing in front of her. It was hiding somewhere behind the people she trusted. Someone wanted Marlowe and Cassius dead. But why? And more importantly, who would benefit if they never lived long enough to find out? If you think you've already figured it out, think again. Part 2 is where every secret begins to unravel. If you don't want to miss it, subscribe to NovaDiary Fiction, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, who do you think is really trying to kill Marlowe and Cassius? See you in the next one.